Drugs policing sharpens the sword of organised crime. It makes it more ruthless. So we should look at the evidence and consider a health-based approach to this really frightening problem that we have.
Hello and welcome back to Crime Suspect. Each week we unravel some of the UK's most prolific crimes, as well as providing in-depth analysis on the criminality that plagues our nation. On the show today, a war on drugs. City gangs across the UK have been targeted by police in a week-long blitz on county lines drug dealers. But is enough being done to protect the most vulnerable people from the grip of these ruthless gangsters? Next, is it safe in your neighbourhood? I'll be taking you, virtually, to Norwich for this week's postcode watch. And finally, it's your chance to book a crook as we show you this week's wanted criminals. Joining me for all of this today is former Prisons Minister and esteemed political commentator Ann Widdecombe, former feared gang member, now a mentor, author and youth worker, Nequela Whittaker. And last but not least, former undercover police officer Neil Woods, who's also an author and an activist. Thank you all very much for being here today. Now, you have the right to remain watching. This is Crime Suspect. So, county lines gangs continue to be shut down at pace across England and Wales. In a recent wave of raids, Scotland Yard alone seized £1.2 million worth of Class A drugs, 458 weapons, including 17 firearms across the capital. And they say they won't stop there. Now, more children than ever are falling prey to these criminal organisations, thanks to the UK's Deliveroo-style cocaine culture, which sees people buying drugs for parties like they're getting a takeaway. With an increase in demand comes an increase in the criminality, and an even greater cost comes to those being exploited at the hands of these dealers. So, Neil, how widespread are these county lines operations, and how dangerous are the criminals running them?
Well, the last official estimate we had of the number of children being exploited into county lines and broader drug dealing was 50,000 children estimated, and that was on the Children's Commissioner's website in 2018. Now, I know, as part of Leap UK and a broad Connect network of police officers and former police officers, that this is increasing. And the reason that more gangs are recruiting children is because it's a very tactical response to police successes. So when I see, in the news, successes to which you've just referred, lots of raids, lots of drugs being seized, people arrested.
Weapons, cash, millions of pounds being seized.
Guns, firearms.
Guns.
Absolutely, but the thing is, the exploitation of children is an adaptation by organised crime. It's a response to the success of policing, or it's a response to the policies that we have in place. And really, it's time, with this many children being traumatised, sealing in the future and the problematic drug use for the future and in this drastically disastrous policy, it's time to start looking at the evidence. Because you're right to say that these gangs are dangerous. Of course they are. They're exploiting children. But they will continue to exploit children as long as these drugs these drug markets are being run by criminals.
No matter how many front doors get smashed in, no matter how many times the handcuffs get slapped on, no matter how many drug dealers go to prison, you say they're not going to stop.
Exactly, because the size of the market remains. And if the size of the market is staying the same, no amount of police activity will impact it. All the police activity will do is make the behaviour of organised crime worse. To put it bluntly, drugs policing sharpens the sword of organised crime. It makes it more ruthless. So we should look at the evidence and consider a health-based approach to this really frightening problem that we have.
Nequela, you spend your time
Yeah.
trying to persuade young people, particularly girls, to not join these drugs gangs. Are they being recruited on a regular, wholesale basis, or is this a small problem that law enforcement can stamp out?
It's a whole scale problem for me. What I'm seeing and I'm noticing is there's a lot of girls now recruiting girls back into the cycle of when they were groomed into it. Now they're seeing that the grooming gang are now seeing the benefits of peer-to-peer grooming. And we're noticing there's a lot of girls that are now coercing their friends to go down that route. So in terms of the scale of it, it's larger. We've got younger girls right through to your girls that are 25 using younger girls to exploit them through nice things, glamorizations, and just yet again, exploiting them through what was done to them. They're now going out with this practice, with these skills of manipulation, and now placing it back onto the younger girls. And it's just a cycle, which is now just like a revolving door for me, what I see.
And are the arrests and the imprisoning of gang members doing anything to stop this cycle?
No. And I would say in terms of that, it's allowing younger people to be victimised. It's stopping them from potentially persevering and moving through life because we're not getting the ones at the top. We're not getting the ones that we really need to. We're getting the low ones that are caught in the net. And currently what we're seeing is the ones that are caught, they're just recycled. They go and get another influx of young people to come and do that. So we need to look at the structure of how we are going to approach and break down this criminal-based gang in terms of going from the top, looking at it in the terms of those who are affected. And sometimes we've got a lot of young people, they're not just victims, some are perpetrators. So we do have to look on it on both scales to understand who is the victim in this business.
Anne, I suspect a lot of what Nequela says would chime with you, wouldn't it?
Some of it might, but certainly not all of it. I'm very relieved that the police are now cracking down big time, you know, with the raids, etc. And you can't dismiss the fact that taking, you know, £1.2 million worth of drugs off the drugs market is a bad thing. You know, it's a good thing. It is a tremendous step forward. But I've always wanted a comprehensive drugs policy, where you know, just raids on this and raids on that isn't the answer. I've always advocated a complete zero-tolerance approach, more or less like Giuliani had in New York, when you, from everybody, from the big suppliers, and you're right, Nequela, you know, not enough is done to get them, from the big suppliers all the way down to small-scale possession, because demand fuels supply just as much as supply fuels demand. And if you don't have that comprehensive drugs policy all the way through, from top to bottom, then you're not going to get on top of the problem. And you won't get on top of the problem in 5 minutes flat. You know, we've let it get out of hand. It's going to be some time to turn around the supertanker.
Neil, what are the main drugs that are, number one, causing the problems, and number two, that the police might be focusing on?
Well, this is interesting because we're talking about county lines today, aren't we? And county lines is almost entirely about the problematic heroin and crack cocaine markets, rather than somebody using recreationally cocaine on a Friday night or whatever. And the reason it's such a huge driver of this exploitation of children is because the most problematic 10% of heroin and crack cocaine users consume 50% of the market value of those drugs, which make that small customer base incredibly lucrative, and that is what is driving the exploitation of these children.
So are you saying the dinner parties that Anne alludes to, the nightclubs, Friday and Saturday night, they are actually only 50% of the market consumers?
No, they're not.
And are you saying they don't matter?
The powder cocaine market is tiny in value compared with the problematic heroin and crack cocaine markets, and that is what's driving the child exploitation. Now, our current drug policy is very un-British, because in our history we had a very effective way of dealing with people who were using heroin and cocaine problematically. We looked after them. So if you had a problem with heroin, heroin was prescribed. Now,
prior to 1971?
Prior to the end of the 1960s. Now,
yeah.
In 1994, Switzerland used British evidence to inform their drug policy. British evidence. And since then, they have been prescribing heroin to people who use heroin problematically. As a result, you will not get any child exploitation in Switzerland. It doesn't happen because the government controls the supply, not criminals. There is no child exploitation like we have in the UK. There are only 2 European countries which have this problem, the UK and Sweden, both have the most extreme and most punitive drug policies. Whatever view you might have about the way we actually police things, there is clear evidence from the Netherlands, from Switzerland, from various places who have a harm reduction approach. They don't have this child exploitation problem. Now, I would suggest this child exploitation problem is such a catastrophe that we should be looking at the best possible evidence from wherever it is in order to tackle it.
Well, I mean, to compare Switzerland to Britain, completely different sort of society, completely different demographics.
They have just as many heroin
Just
users.
a second, I didn't barge in on you.
My apologies.
What I was saying was that you can't compare completely demographically different countries. I don't think you can do that. And, you know, we have tried in the past quite hard on the heroin front. And when I was doing a documentary on prostitutes, they were all on Class A drugs. And why were they on the game? To fund the Class A drugs. Now, interestingly, one of them said to me, oh, yes, they're giving out free methadone here. You know, we're getting methadone. They didn't regard it as a substitute for the heroin. They regarded it as a free hit kindly supplied by the state. So, you know, I think it's a bit naive to imagine that you can get over the heroin problem, and crack cocaine, but particularly I'm looking now at heroin. You can get over the heroin problem simply by being very nice and trying to treat people, because they don't always comply in the way that you're suggesting. It just doesn't happen.
Well, the evidence does bear up what I'm saying.
The evidence in Switzerland.
Nequela, the young people groomed into these gangs, these supply gangs, do you hear tales of them supplying not only to the problem users, but also to people that might like a pill, a line or whatever it may be on a Friday or Saturday night when they're going to a gig or a club?
The young people are, they're pharmacy for all types of drugs. So you get your teachers that might have a blowout on the weekend. You get your lawyers, your solicitors. Young people sometimes are very much shocked when they understand that there are substance misusers who are functioning. There's also substance misusers who are not functioning. So they see both clienteles and both groups of people, and the common point that we're getting down to, they're both drug takers at different forms.
Is this because they're supplying to both?
Yeah, they're supplying
the
to
teachers, the chippies, the plumbers, the sparks, and all of that, as well as the
they're normal substance misusers, your normal crackheads, your normal heroin-based addicts. They're now reaching out to another part of the society.
Heroin's been across the classes ever since I can remember. I mean, you think of Paul Shannon's daughter, for example. No, heroin's been there. It's never just been a lower class problem. Ever.
But of course, cocaine, we had an explosion of cocaine onto the streets of Britain in the 1980s. And I was very much at the forefront of trying to combat that, thinking at the time, working undercover, that we were on the side of the angels and this was a war that could be won. Well, there have been generations of police officers after me, including courageous undercover police officers. But if we look at all the work that they've done, all the prisons that we've filled with so many dealers, importers, wholesalers, none of this police activity has affected the demand. And how do we tackle the demand?
I mean, I think that's a crucially important question, because if your demand only came from your addicts, you know, you wouldn't actually have the size of problem that we've got. If you have very small-scale possession of, say, cannabis, you know, something very small, I still nevertheless think that you should have to pay a penalty for doing that, even if it's only a fixed fine. Because if you don't combat demand in the same focused way that you try to combat supply, then it doesn't happen.
So we've had Nequela saying take out the top ones.
Oh, I agree with that.
Yourself saying take out the ones on street corners as well. With all of this activity, and let's face it, it's been going on, the police activity, for decades now, has any of it really made a shred of difference to the amount of people taking drugs, the harm that's created by drugs, and the profits that are made by villains?
Well, no, not only has it not made any difference, it's much worse than that, because police activity in the drug markets actually makes the drug markets more violent. The use of police informants is a serious commodity which raises the levels of violence, because, let's face it, the scariest gang doesn't get grassed up, right? So if you've got police informants in that marketplace, that's your incentive to become the most ruthless gang. So police activity is actually making things worse. And as long as we have prohibition, as long as we have criminals in control of this market...
You want to ditch prohibition?
What, sorry?
You want to ditch prohibition?
I want to take control because it's out of control at the
By
moment.
ditching prohibition?
Prohibition is the surrendering of control. So we need to take legal control. But more importantly is the problematic drug use of heroin and crack cocaine. If we go back to our history, go back to the British system where we take care of people instead of criminalising them, we take control. Because look, people who use drugs problematically, they're self-medicating for trauma. And we have a situation now where we have at least 50,000 children being traumatised themselves. And what kind of adulthood are they going to have?
Nequela, there's a risk of arrest. There's a risk of violence from another gang.
Yep.
What drew you into that world in the very first instance?
What drew me into it was wanting more, wanting what the other young people had, not being satisfied with what my mum was giving me with the money she had. So wanting that more, that extra, it allowed me to start to divulge in different parts of the environment where I was hanging and mixing with substance misusers. And at the time, I was vulnerable. I was quite impressionable. So for me, I then started to see vulnerabilities in the substance misusers, and that became a match made in heaven for exploiting each other. And then once I started to understand the roots of exploitation, I then went on to a criminal gang that groomed me to start selling drugs internationally as a meal.
So other people's vulnerabilities created for you opportunities.
There we go.
Did you see a lot of violence?
Yeah. There's a lot of violence in regards to it. A lot of violence between substance misusers. There was a lot of violence in the way I had to portray myself when I was selling drugs, just to... It's that bravado, innit? Once you put off that bravado, you're now showing the power that you have with these substance misusers, because there are times when they feel they have the power, when they are high, when they are with all of their friends. So sometimes you have to enforce violence beyond measures, just to explain that maybe you're not that dealer who's going to be getting robbed left, right and centre. So if you show a weapon, then they understand there's a buy-in here. OK, we can respect what you're doing and I'm going to respect what you're doing. So respect comes out of a place of disrespect occurring.
And we hear this violence, don't we?
Yep.
Exploitation, vulnerability. How are we going to reduce it and reduce the harm that the drugs industry causes?
Well, Nequela and I were involved in a documentary of many, many years ago now on girl gangs. And the thing that horrified me at the time was that every single girl, and I mean, they weren't all 20, you know, there were teenagers there. Every single girl carried a knife in her handbag as a matter of course. We've got to get on top of knife crime.
Yeah.
You see, you can't just separate crimes and say there's drug crime, there's gun crime, there's knife crime. They're all interwoven. And you've got to tackle them all. I mean, otherwise it's hopeless. But also, going back to what Nequela said, which I think is very important, she almost passed it over, education failing. You know, you have a truant, you've got a potential drug user.
Yeah.
What do we do about drugs? Neil?
We take back control. We take back control by making them legally regulated, because the violence that's just been described there does not happen in legal markets. Child exploitation doesn't happen in legal markets.
Thank you. Anne?
We certainly don't make them legal, which simply makes them more widely available. What we do is have proper zero tolerance, but through the whole chain, from supply all down to very small demand, because they fuel each other.
I say Public Health Act. I say we need to help those that's been traumatised in the system, and we need to regulate how the control of drugs is being run through our communities and in society. So public health, support, support, support.
Well, thank you all very much indeed for your contributions. Right, moving on to this week's Postcode Watch, and we're in Norwich, Norfolk's most dangerous city. The annual crime rate here was 106 crimes per 1,000 people as of 2022. The most common crimes in Norwich are violence and sexual offences, with 9,705 offences during 2022, which is actually 6% lower than 2021's figure of 10,297, progress perhaps by that police service. The least common but growing crime here is robbery, with 196 offences, which is an increase of 40% from the 140 recorded crimes in 2021. That is a significant increase. Now, if you happen to live in the city centre east, then look away now, as it's the most dangerous neighbourhood in Norwich, followed by city centre west in second place, and Lakenham and Tuxwood as the third most dangerous area. Norwich's safest neighbourhood is Earlham Road and College Road, Old Catton and Thorpe Street, Andrew North. I have to say that just a few short years ago, I went to Norwich for a stag do, and it was wonderful. There were plenty of police on the main streets on the Friday and Saturday evening, and I, for one, didn't feel in the slightest bit in fear. All right, it's time for the part of the show where we bring you mugs of thugs who are terrorising our streets. Have you seen these criminals? First up is this suspect. Police are trying to locate this man in connection with a series of burglaries that all took place on the 19th of October. Anyone who knows this man should contact the Bury neighbourhood team. Next, we have David Jason Phillips, who is wanted for breaching his licence conditions after he was released from prison for committing assault. He's 49 and stands at 6'1" tall, with a medium build and receding grey hair and brown eyes. Lastly, have you seen this criminal? Alex Ogden is known by police around the country, but his most recent known attack took place in Islington in London, where he violently assaulted a 50-year-old man. He is described as a stocky white male with a distinctive haircut of a top knot and shaved sides, and he speaks with a Yorkshire accent. If you think you know or have seen any of these crooks, get in touch anonymously with Crime Stoppers on 0800 555 111. Right, that's all we've got time for this week. Many thanks to Neil, Nequela and Anne. Be sure to leave us a comment, like and subscribe, and we'll be back next week for more Crime Suspects.